Hello, my bio stars, welcome back. Go ahead and get out whatever you've been taking notes on, and we are going to jump right on in into Unit 6, Topic 4, which is on neurons and synapses. I underlined neurons today because basically today we're talking about neurons, and next class we're talking about synapses, and then that'll be it for the nervous system. And so I want you to just think about, before you move on, how does your brain send and receive signals? And also think about just what does the nervous system do in general? And then meet me back here. So hopefully you thought a little bit about how the brain sends and receives signals. This topic really kind of dives really specifically into one specific piece of the neuron system, of the nervous system, which is kind of like the nervous system's unit, smallest unit, which would be a neuron. It is assuming that you already understand that the nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord and all of your nerves in your body, and it basically is kind of like your body's electrical wiring. It sends signals to and from your brain. So that's kind of our baseline understanding. If you need a little bit more background on the nervous system, I'll post a video that explains kind of the nervous system in general. And then this particular lesson is going to dive into that specific cell of the nervous system called a neuron. So that is your guiding question for today, is what is a neuron and how do neurons function? My meme, I think, is really funny. So this is what a neuron looks like with pants on, I guess. But it says, if a neuron wore pants, would it wear them like this, or like this? I just thought it was really funny. So you can come up why this is important. It is super important for our brain to send and receive signals. If we weren't able to send and receive signals from our brain, you wouldn't be able to move your hands or move your eyes or move your muscles or breathe. Basically, it is our electrical wiring. It makes sure that our body can respond to external and internal stimuli and keep us living and functioning, which is pretty cool. So let's jump right in. What is a neuron? I'm going to get rid of me so you can see the pictures. So neurons are specialized cells that transmit electrical impulses within the nervous system. Basically, they are sending signals to and from your brain so that you can do things like move your muscles. This is what a neuron looks like. This is a really general form of a neuron. There are other forms that neurons take, but this is what you will think of when you see a neuron. And we're going to learn about all these different pieces of it. Not all of them, but most of them. Here's a little brief of the nervous system, and again, I'll post that video of more background on the nervous system if you need it. But basically, the whole point of the nervous system is to convert sensory information into electrical impulses so that you can quickly detect and respond to stimuli. And my example I always give is your hand on a hot stove. The whole point of your nervous system is so that if you put your hand on a hot stove, all of your neurons in your hand are going to basically send a signal to your brain that's saying, alert, 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 something is going on, my hand is burning, and then your brain is going to send a signal back to your hand through neurons that says, move your freaking hand. And so that obviously happens extremely quickly, like in less than a second, right? But your neurons are the ones that are sending that signal from your sensory cells on your fingers up to your brain, and then your brain sends the signal back to your muscle to move. Pretty cool. So what is the structure of a neuron? What does a neuron look like? So this picture is just another picture of a neuron, and I like this one because the ones that you really need to know are bolded here. So neurons can look different according to their role. You could probably figure out what a sensory neuron, a relay neuron, or a motor neuron is if I just give you a second to think. So try and figure that out for a second while I turn off those notifications because I know they're loud. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. So what does a sensory neuron sound like? A sensory neuron is a neuron that's going to send sensory information, so meaning information that comes from your five senses, smelling, tasting, touching, I'm bad at this, eyesight, and what's the fifth sense I'm forgetting? Oh, hearing. Smelling, tasting, touching, seeing, hearing. Oh, it's been a long couple weeks, y'all. So a sensory neuron is going to take any information that you get from those five senses and send them to your brain through your relay neurons. Your relay neurons are kind of the in-betweens, the ones that take things to your brain and back away from your brain. And then your motor neurons go from your brain back to your muscles so that you can move if you need to. But all of these neurons share three basic components that you need to know. The first being dendrites, which you see here. So all of these little like tentacle looking things, those are dendrites. Dendrites are short branch fibers that basically convert chemical information from neurons, other neurons around it, or other receptor cells into electrical signals. And we're going to really learn about like exactly how this happens, and it gets a little bit in the weeds, but it's really cool. But basically these dendrites are going to be really, really close to the axon or to the axon terminals of other neurons so that the neurons can communicate with each other. So the dendrites are basically converting the chemical information they get and translating it into electrical signals. The axon, on the other hand, the axon is this long kind of outshoot of the neuron. The axon is a really long fiber, and it transmits the electrical signal to the ends of the neuron. And then once that electrical signal reaches the end of this neuron, it's going to be converted into a chemical signal that can then go to another dendrite. And that's really what we talk about when we talk about synapses tomorrow. And then the soma is basically just the cell body. The soma is going to be where you find the nucleus and any organelles and any features that are essential to just the survival of the neuron itself, rather than just the neuron function, but making sure the neuron cell survives. It does cell respiration, and it gets rid of waste and takes in nutrients that it needs. So those are the three main parts of neurons that you need to know. So the dendrites, the axon, and the soma. All right, and then this is just another kind of picture of what a neuron, a typical motor neuron or a nerve cell looks like. So in some neurons, and in most of the neurons that you'll see in photos, they're also going to be surrounded by this insulating and protective layer that we call the myelin sheath. So if you see all of these little kind of like button looking thingies, those are the myelin sheath. It's basically like a layer of fat that insulates the axon and actually allows the electrical signal to travel faster. So exactly what this says, it improves the conduction speed of electrical impulses along the axon, but it does require additional space and energy. It's additional cell parts, so it requires more nutrients, more energy, and more space. But if you look at this picture as well, you'll also see the myelin sheath. They just have represented it differently, and sometimes that myelin sheath is also called a Schwann cell. So now you know the general structure of a neuron, and now we're really going to talk about how neurons send signals. And I want you to go into this knowing it can get a little... When you first learn about this, it's a lot, but I know you guys can do it. Just come back to these notes and try and maybe draw diagrams of the directions in which things are moving, and you'll definitely get it. And also, please utilize office hours with me. I would love to help y'all with this. But let's think about how neurons send signals. So neurons generate and transmit electrical signals by pumping positively charged ions, sodium and potassium, across their membrane. So basically, all of the electrical signal of a neuron is literally comes down to the location of the sodium and the potassium. Basically, what it does is it creates an unequal distribution of ions on different sides of the membrane, and that just creates a membrane potential. You can think of it like when we learned about passive and active transport. You're basically moving all of one ion type to one side and all of one ion type to another side, so that you have really, really strong concentration gradients, so that those ions want to move, right? They want to move from high to low concentration. And so that when you need to send that electrical signal, you can open up those floodgates and the ions can switch and even out, and that kind of creates the electrical potential. This picture basically shows it wonderfully. You can see on the outside of the cell, there is way more sodium, right? See all that yellow sodium on the outside of the cell? I know it's not like all sodium, we still see some potassium, but you can see that membrane potential there, the difference. On the outside of the cell, there is way more sodium, whereas on the inside of the cell down here, there is way, way more potassium. That's basically the basis of how a neuron is going to send an electrical signal. This picture that you're looking at is the resting potential. A resting potential is basically just the fact that there is a difference in charge based on the inside versus the outside of the neuron. So we call it a resting potential when the neuron is not firing, when it's not sending a signal. And in a typical resting potential, the inside of the neuron is more negative relative to the outside by about negative 70 millivolts if you're like really into the physics of how it works. And you'll have to learn this if you take a biology class in college. But yeah, the inside of the neuron is going to be more negative relative to the outside by about negative 70 millivolts. And I want to go back to this picture of the neuron really quickly. We are talking about this cell right here. I mean, this is one cell. It just has some really interesting like projections off the side of it. But we're talking about this axon. And we're talking about the inside of the axon having more potassium and the outside of the axon having more sodium. Okay. So how is this resting potential maintained? So before we talk about how these potassium and the sodium move, let's just talk about how it ends up looking like this. How do we end up having way more sodium on the outside and way more potassium on the inside before we even think about sending a signal from our brain to our hand to move our hand off of a hot stove, right? So in order to maintain that resting potential, I would hope that you would think that's got to require some form of energy, right? Because if we were not actively keeping all the sodium outside and all the potassium inside, then there's going to be passive diffusion, and the potassium's going to want to move out and the sodium's going to want to move in. That's just what's going to happen. But we have to use ATP to basically keep the concentration gradients really, really strong. So the sodium-potassium pump is a protein that spans the entirety of the cell membrane. That's why we call it transmembrane. So this would be a transmembrane protein here. And it basically actively exchanges sodium and potassium by using ATP energy. This is probably not the best picture I should have put here because this is just showing leakage channels. This isn't showing the actual potassium pump. But basically what the sodium-potassium pump does is it uses ATP and it pushes 3 sodium ions out of the cell for every 2 potassium ions that it brings in. And basically what you're seeing in this picture is that, yes, what you're thinking is right. There is still going to be some sodium and potassium that leak back due to that really strong concentration gradient. But for the most part, those pumps are basically going to push all the sodium out and bring all the potassium in to the cell. And it creates that electrochemical gradient where the cell interior becomes much more negative compared to the cell exterior. So now that we know basically that in a neuron, when it's just resting, when it's not sending a signal, you are going to have a lot of sodium on the outside of the cell and a lot of potassium on the inside. So what happens when I need to send that signal from my brain to my hand to move because it's on a hot stove? This is where an action potential comes in. An action potential is when there's a rapid change in charge across the membrane, and this happens when the neuron is firing, when the neuron is sending that signal. And it happens in 3 stages, and the 3 stages you need to know happen in this order always. First is depolarization, second is repolarization, and third is the refractory period. This is this crazy graph where if you take any bio class in college, you'll totally know this graph, but it's good to be introduced to it now so that you can feel like you've seen it before. And I like this because it basically explains exactly what's happening. Here's this stimulus. Here is your hand on the hot stove, right? And then what's going to happen is the neuron has to send that electrical signal to your brain, and then your brain has to send a motor signal back to your hand. That's the depolarization phase. That's where basically all of the sodium channels are going to open. And if you remember, there's a ton of sodium outside of the cell. Let's see if I can draw a little bit here, y'all. Let's see what I can do. So let's say that this is your cell membrane. I know that it's actually a bilayer, and we have a bunch of sodium out here and a bunch of potassium on the inside. So depolarization, this is basically when the first part of the signal sending, all of this sodium is going to rush inside the cell. And then repolarization, you can probably guess. Let's change colors. Repolarization is when all of this potassium is going to rush outside of the cell. So basically the sodium and potassium are switching places. And then the refractory period is, here they call it hyperpolarization, but this is also the refractory period, is when the sodium is going back out and the potassium is going back in, so that the neuron can send a signal again. So, it seems like a lot, but as long as you know kind of the basics of what's going on, I'm fine with that. Okay, so let's talk about it. Let's look at depolarization. So depolarization is the sudden change in membrane potential from a negative to a positive internal charge. This is what happens when basically the dendrite of a neuron, so let's go look at our neuron picture again. I have to go back and find our neuron. Here it is. So the dendrite of this neuron has received a chemical signal at this point, and we're going to learn more about what those signals are next time, but has received a chemical signal, and it now knows, hey, I need to pass this message on to my next neuron, so it eventually gets to the brain. So the dendrite gets that chemical signal, and it causes all of the sodium channels to open within the membrane of the axon. So basically that dendrite gets the signal, and then all of the sodium channels open, and the sodium, like we know, is much more concentrated outside of the neuron. So the opening of the channels, it's basically just like a flood of passive diffusion, because we know that there's way more sodium outside than inside. So all that sodium wants to move from high to low concentration, so it rushes into the cell. And basically that influx of sodium causes the membrane potential to become much more positive. And that's what we call the depolarization. And if you look at the graph, that kind of makes sense, because we know we're usually at that negative 70. It's usually negative, and then all that sodium rushes in and it becomes positive. That's depolarization. So basically, if you can remember, depolarization is like the rushing in of sodium, you're fine. And then here is a really good picture of depolarization. This is basically what resting potential is here. We see that the potassium channel is closed, and we see that outside the cell there's way more sodium, and inside the cell there's way more potassium. And then the depolarization is basically this sodium channel becomes open and all the sodium rushes in. Now, repolarization. So repolarization is when you're restoring the membrane resting potential following a signal being sent. Basically, after you influx all that sodium, the potassium channels are also going to open within the membrane, and we know that there's way more potassium on the inside. So the opening of the channels causes all that potassium to leave and basically go from high to low concentration again. And all of that leaving potassium causes the membrane potential to return to being more negative on the inside. And if we look at the picture, so this is where we were left off with depolarization. After depolarization, we see that there's a lot of sodium and a lot of potassium on the inside, and then there's not a lot of potassium on the outside. So once that potassium channel, this green channel, opens, all the potassium is going to want to rush out, to kind of restore the balance. And then last but not least is that refractory period. And the refractory period is the time after a nerve signal before the neuron can fire again. So in a normal resting state, we know that the sodium ions should be mainly outside and the potassium ions are mainly inside. But right after you send a signal, it's actually kind of the opposite at this point. If we look here, we have a lot of sodium on the inside. Sorry, my face is in the way. A lot of sodium on the inside and a lot of potassium on the outside. So the refractory period is when that sodium potassium pump is working to flip that balance again so that you can send more signals. So, like I said, following the depolarization and repolarization, the ionic distribution is mainly reversed. So basically all the sodium has gone inside and all the potassium has gone outside. And so before the neuron can fire again, the sodium potassium pump basically restores that resting potential by pumping 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums in. And here is a picture of that. So we see this is right after repolarization, a lot of potassium on the outside, a lot of sodium on the inside, and then we turn on that sodium potassium pump, and it's going to pump the sodium out and pump the potassium in, and then the neuron is ready to send another signal in case you put your hand on a hot stove again, which hopefully you didn't. Okay. I know that was a lot. If you need to, slow me down, come to office hours, ask me any questions. But today's activity is super short. I just want you to watch the really short video. It's literally 2 minutes. And then complete the worksheet that I linked on Google Classroom. That worksheet is basically just definitions. I just want to make sure you understand the definitions that I gave you today. And that's it. Please log on to office hours to ask me any questions that you have and say hello. Really miss y'all. I hope you guys are all doing good. And hopefully I will get to see y'all soon. Stay safe.